about the case, it would suggest that that was what the whole case was based upon. For 3 days straight, we heard about the interception of an Al-Qaeda cell and a terrorist that was planning to attack civilians at shopping malls. Read the indictment and you'll find that it was the word of a person who himself was trying to stay out of prison. Just the hearsay of a confidential informant. Of course, it is the most excessive of the allegations the media focuses on, emphasizing repeatedly the severity of the plot, and sending a message that is sure to implant itself firmly on the subconscious of all those listening, whether attentively or preferably in passing by. An audience that cares little for detail and is quite comfortable with the simplistic narrative offered by network and cable news outlets. In nearly each of these cases, journalists interviewing associates or neighbors or family members of the victims of the entrapment reveal that they cannot believe the accused would commit such heinous crimes. That's because they would not have. While apparently neutral and balanced commentary, this has the actual effect of convincing the public that anyone, any Muslim, while appearing as a peaceful member of society, may very well be plotting attacks in America. And it's hard to imagine the law enforcement practices and mainstream press coverage are not deliberate. As Noam Chomsky, MIT professor from Massachusetts here, has described, the function of the media as propaganda is to democracy what the bludgeon is to the totalitarian state. The only threat to this system of control is people like Tarek Mehanna. People with the courage to denounce the misinformation and stand up in the face of its aggression. In fact, not allowing himself to be bullied by the coercion of authority was Tarek's major crime. His case is as much the outcome of targeted harassment and persecution as it is effective terror prevention. But in climates like ours today, dissidents increasingly confront the utilization not only of unjust law enforcement practices, but of an interpretation of the law that prefers the bludgeon. The post-9/11 era is replete with terror cases that are initiated by government agents, and that would all be impossible without the claims of informants that they have access to the weapons, explosives, or materials that would make the plots possible. It is safe to say that in every case, even if the defendants had some inclination to commit an act of terror, which I might add is hardly believable in all of the cases, they could not have obtained the resources necessary to carry them out, or would not have tried due to the enormous difficulty and lack of technical know-how. It is also interesting to note that when real terror cases do occur, which are almost always planned and initiated overseas, they never cover the specifics of the statements or calls, or why they engaged in efforts to attack Americans. A recent example of this was the Faisal Shahzad arrest. Shahzad was effectively radicalized after witnessing the effects of American drone attacks in Pakistan and their normal killing of civilians rather than their intended military targets. This led him to desire carrying out indiscriminate attacks against civilians, foreign policy and the effects of it that he witnessed, not the hatred of liberalism or democracy. However, the mainstream press chooses rather to emphasize the fact that he showed no remorse in the courtroom, that he was stone cold, and neglected his emphasis on U.S. foreign policy altogether as cause. Likewise, when Joseph Stack, a non-Muslim, flew his private airplane into an IRS building a few months ago, he left a lengthy suicide note mentioning the oppressive nature of domestic American politics and citing his position that the U.S. government constantly caters to an oligarchic business class. But for its part, the mainstream press did not cover his act as an act of terrorism. They did, however, emphasize a questioning of his sanity, and for the most part failed altogether to mention the domestic oppression and consequential hopelessness he cited as true cause. Still, all of these cases led to, or seemingly will lead to, conviction. The reason is due to the nature of the definition of entrapment as defined in the American legal canon, and the social climate of passivity and non-resistance. Usually, a successful entrapment defense requires the defendant to prove three things. Firstly, the idea of committing the crime came from the law enforcement officers rather than from the defendant himself. And secondly, that the law enforcement officers induced the person to commit the crime. These two evidences are what are known as objective proofs. They have to deal with the nature of the law enforcement tactics and approach. In nearly all of the cases we discussed, the idea came from the officers. The attack would not have been possible without their offering supplies and other assistance, and there is oftentimes ample proof of coaxing and coercion. However, the other side of an entrapment case is what is called the subjective proof, where it must be established that the, quote, defendant was not ready and willing to commit this type of crime before being induced to do so. And this is where we have the conundrum that oftentimes leads to prosecution. Most courts allow a defendant's predisposition to be demonstrated through prior conduct or reputation, thus alluding to the website. This is why the majority of case complaints and indictments are usually concocted and exaggerated charges that would prove scanty based on evidence alone. However, they are always surrounded by proliferate amounts of character assassination, showing the extremist views of the defendant. Add these to a general climate of widespread fear and Islamist scare, and one can imagine how hard it is to win a jury trial today as a Muslim with an entrapment defense. In Tarek's case, not unlike others, this is represented sort of, not to a T, but sort of, in the constant referral to his opposition of American occupation, if you read the indictment, and interference in the affairs of foreign Muslim lands. Indeed, the very last cited complaints against him read that he, quote, found it unfathomable that the United States military has military bases in the heart of the Muslim world, and that the, quote, land of Muhammad is being used as a military base to attack Muslims, unquote. And also that in the US he felt like a fish out of water. These quotes are sandwiched between recorded conversations of him expressing passion for jihad, allegedly, something that is binding on every Muslim but means much more than mere physical conflict, fighting, and war. His observing videos pertaining to jihad was highlighted, and other things that are not crimes in and of themselves, but that then in the trial set the stage for what becomes the basis of a character representation that demonizes and seeks to create guilt by character association, whether or not there was any real objective data that the defendant desired to commit the crimes he is accused of. Thus the importance of turning out to show support. This is a deliberate process of the post-9/11 Patriot Act mentality. Any Muslim that espouses the belief in the right of self-determination for Muslims in Muslim lands, any Muslim that dresses overly Islamic, that grows a beard, and that has a negative opinion of the effect of U.S. foreign policy in the world, or that generally believes Islam has a role to play in the political and economic life of Muslims, apart from U.S. domination, is a potential terrorist. This belief was academized in a report by the NYPD in 2007. The report, titled Radicalization in the West, the Homegrown Threat, outlined a process of radicalism that consists of 4 phases: pre-radicalization, self-identification, indoctrination, and jihadization. A person is a, quote, normal good Muslim throughout the pre-radicalization stage, but initiates a pathway to hate and violence in the self-identification stage, where it is believed that a, quote, cognitive opening or crisis which shakes one's certitude in previously held beliefs occurs, unquote. Here, the initiation of a quest for violence is begun. When unremarkable individuals, as they say, become aware of their unremarkability, and in anger, adjust their worldview to one of alleged hate and animosity. The mainstream press has picked up on this stage and is quick to seek out exposés of radicals that document their initiation into a life of radicalism. CNN becoming much more like Fox News each and every single day.